Hello, everyone. Welcome to the question and answer session. I noticed a few of you joining the meeting. So if you have any questions for Tom or Anne, please unmute your mic, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, and you can question them directly. Alternatively, you can type your questions into the chat option on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Thank you for attending the presentations today.
And maybe a question for you. Do you know Jody DeYoung from University of Minnesota?
Yes.
Extension, okay. I'd been in contact with her, sort of doing background for this. She said there was a farmer she knew there that grew potatoes and did no-till as well.
I've seen something, I think, on Twitter with that.
Okay.
I haven't seen too many potato guys here going quite that way. I think there's one or two that do strip till. Be a tough one to make work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued as to what they mean by no-till.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you had issues with cover crops or getting cover crops established on potato land?
Depends on which crop of potatoes. So there's a group of guys who grow for the potato chip market. So a lot of that'll come off a little bit earlier. They have a lot more opportunities. One of the fellows that I used to work with, they were putting radish on after the potatoes were off and getting wonderful growth because there's usually a fair bit of residual nitrogen left there. And especially on their soil, they were actually having problems with well water getting really high nitrate levels. But for some of the later crop, it's a little harder to fit it into the system. Especially it's a bit further north than I am. So fall comes a bit quicker. But a lot of them are using barley. When I get it up into the Georgian Bay area, they tend to be more barley than oats, a little bit more rye maybe.
They put barley on after harvest or before harvest and then use the harvest operation to incorporate it?
I haven't seen too many putting it on before harvest.
Okay.
I know there was some stuff out in PEI looking at that years ago.
Right.
Tried selling it here, it hasn't really caught on.
Yeah. When you say radish, what do you, is that the tillage radish, the ones with the very long stems, or a different type of radish?
The daikon radish, the big white roots. That tends to be the radish that's used for cover crops for the most part, unless they get short on seed or they're looking for a cheap seed source, and then you'll see the old oilseed radish show up. And had a few guys have that show up in their seed mix here. They weren't too.
My brother-in-law in Ontario had grown radish like in rotation or cover, but he said never again because his land was tile drained. And the radish had gone down. He didn't know about it and found out about it, I guess, and had to do a lot of excavation and cleaning out of tiles. So do you recommend that it be killed at a certain stage or date post-seeding?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that go along with managing radish. And if I had a longer presentation, normally I talk through all the different species, and the tile concern is one of the things that comes up. We've had problems in Ontario, they've had problems in Quebec. It's usually related to heavy seedings, early seedings, so early harvested crops, lots of residual nitrogen, whether there's been manure applied or something like that. And it's often connected with a tile system that has some issues. So it could be how the connectors went in, whether there's a sharp edge that all the little root hairs will catch on, or a place where they can kind of collect that maybe the tile isn't as level as it once was. Because I've also had growers who've used radish and told me quite excitedly that they can see all the little root hairs blowing out at the ditch, and it's like, oh, that's cool. I'm glad they're blowing out because
Yeah.
we've definitely had problems. We've had problems with winter wheat.
Okay.
In some tile systems if there's an issue.
What's the rooting depth of the radishes? Like how deep do they go down?
Well, see, tile can be fairly shallow, so it might only be 2 feet down. But the bulk of the radish will only be about 6 to 8 inches down. And then just like sugar beet roots, it goes really deep after that, but it's a very fine root.
Yeah, I've heard they're used quite extensively for compaction issues, but as a cover crop, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, they don't excite me for compaction even, because you know, if you look at the scientific research, the things that we can get to help with compaction are those perennial root systems that have time to grow. So I don't know, I've seen work with chicory, with alfalfa, some of the more longer perennial grasses. Radish, we're expecting them to bust up compaction in 2 months, 3 months. That's not really, and when you see a radish after it's died, it looks like a loofah sponge. There's not much to it. So I haven't been that convinced it will do something with the surface structure and the surface compaction, but I have pictures showing radish that have corkscrew roots. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Your presentation, Ann, had a lot of single species plantings. Is there any desire or intent to go into mixed species? You know, some of these alternate sort of cover crop mixes for fallow years, I've seen 7, I've seen up to 13 different species. I mean, there's a cost issue, of course, with that, but is there a low cost sensible mix that you find?
Oh yeah, there's a number of relatively low cost sensible mixes out there, and there's lots of guys who are using mixes. It's more a matter of looking at the mix and creating one that, or working with a seed company that has one already that isn't that expensive, and also adjusting your seeding rate. So we did a cover crop biomass survey this past fall, and I surveyed a number of mixed cover crops, and some of them, like one of the fellows that I interviewed, he puts on, you know, maybe 35, 38 pounds of seed. And he had, because he also had manure in his mix, like he had heavy application of hog manure, he had growth up to my waist. And actually, I'm a little concerned. I have a time-lapse camera out in his field because I'm a little concerned about what he's going to have to deal with come spring. There's lots of mixes out there, and there's mixes that you can get made up that are very cost effective. It also depends, you know, what are you putting in for species? How expensive are they? A lot of the legumes are more expensive. You start putting Phacelia in, that gets expensive. But some of those are very small seeds, so it doesn't take a lot. And usually we're using a base of oats or barley or rye. That's the bulk, and that's the carrier that's going to take it through whatever seeding unit you're using. And there's some really cool work being done. Dr. Dave Hooker and Manish Rashida at University of Guelph have so far 4 years in on a long-term cover crop rotation tillage trial. That's starting at 4 years to start to show us some interesting results. And Laura Vineyard has some longer term stuff. I think I talked about some of that with some simple mixes, and she's starting to get into some of the more complex mixes too.
And excuse me, Anne, it appears we have a question in the chat, and this is from Deanne Madsen, and she asked, does Ontario have legislation like Alberta's Soil Conservation Act to deal with soil conservation issues?
Not really. We have some legislation around topsoil, but do we have anything? I'm not exactly sure what your conservation legislation relates to exactly. What does it cover?
I'll just give a brief synopsis. It's legislation that empowers the local counties to enforce protection of soil. So a farmer has to keep their soil on the field and keep soil from degrading that's in the field. So they have to take certain matters and practice, not the conventional practice, that's what caused the problem, but the ag fieldman can go in and sort of dictate that you must change your practice from A to B in order to prevent erosion from continuing to occur.
No. No, that's a fairly simple answer then. No, we don't have anything like that. If you had a severe erosion event and it ended up filling your local county road full of soil that came from your field, yeah, the municipality can probably come back in and bill you for cleaning up the road, but there's nobody that's going to be able to enforce. There's a little bit of legislation around our system of ditches, and you can't pollute that way. There's legislation around tile and tile entry into ditches, and there's legislation around water movement across farms, so you can't impede the water movement within a drainage watershed. So there is legislation, but nothing that specifically speaks to on-farm practices and somebody being able to tell, somebody from the county being able to come in and tell you how to farm. There's nothing like that. In fact,
for farms or fields where you have massive erosion, it's you just leave it alone, or I mean, is it up to the ministry or the local authority or the conservation authority, or who?
The conservation authorities are tasked more with their original purpose for being was for flood control. And so now the conservation authorities do have a little bit more power, and they tend to have, they've had better funding in recent years. So the conservation authorities actually have agronomists, some of the larger ones on staff, who work with farmers in certain watersheds to try and improve things, but it's pretty much on a voluntary basis. So it's more peer support or peer pressure.
Thanks very much, Anne. And actually a follow-up question, or excuse me, another question, and this is from Ken Pearl. And he states, a fair amount of data quantifying yield loss for cereals. Are there data for row crop yield reductions? For example, sugar beets, potatoes, dry beans?
With cover crops, the yield data, we don't have as much on. The work that I showed in my presentation is mostly the summary work that Laura Vineyard's done. There's also a larger meta-analysis that she worked on that with some people from Quebec that showed something similar. Didn't tend to look at sugar beets, dry beans, not so much either. And sorry, for us, our sugar beet crop's only about 10,000 acres. So the research that's done in Ontario on sugar beets tends to be very much production focused and not as much with cover crops. That said, anecdotally, I do have a grower who recently sung the praises of planting oats and having oats in before his sugar beet crop. So generally he would do all his soil, he would harvest the previous crop and plant the do all his tillage, plant the cover crop of oats, and then he would have those would die off. They wouldn't get very big, they'd die off, but it would set him up nicely to do just a light tickle in the springtime, just after the frost has come out, and then get his sugar beets in. And he's a pretty aggressive and, I say, proactive grower. He's quite aware of the potential for wind erosion on his soils. But he's saying he sees a definite yield boost. Has he measured it? No, because he keeps forgetting to put strips in for me.
Thanks very much, Anne. And if anyone has any other questions, you can unmute your mic by selecting the Join Audio button in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Alternatively, you can type your question into the chat.
Hey, Tom and Ann, it's Larry Nikiforuk. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can. Hi, Larry.
I have a question. I've heard the term soil health tossed around fairly loosely these days, and yet there seems to be no real consensus as to what soil health is. So what metrics are you guys using in Ontario to define soil health? And given the fact that in my 40 years of experience mapping soils in Alberta, every soil looks healthy to me. So I don't know what metrics people use, and I mean I go on gardening websites and everyone's talking about, oh, this is a healthy soil, this is an unhealthy soil. What is it?
Okay, so you want from the Ontario perspective?
Sure. Well, yeah, it'd be nice to know what soil health is, given the fact that no one really knows what it means.
And
I mean, it's
right.
like saying, it's like saying, from a pedological perspective, oh, the soil has really nice tilth. What are the metrics around soil tilth? What are the metrics around soil health?
Yeah, and that is a big conundrum for us, to be honest. We usually talk about soil health, though, as whether it's performing the function that's expected of it. So in an agricultural setting, is it performing all the functions that we need? Is it being productive while also protecting the environment? That's kind of loosely paraphrasing it. As far as the metrics, that is still a bit of a crapshoot depending on who you talk to. So we have commercial labs who are providing soil health tests or elements of soil health tests, packages that they have put together that they feel encompass a definition of soil health. We have within the ministry and the research community here have been working on a soil health testing package. And actually that was some of my work this morning, was working on a soil health assessment plan. So that's trying to do a soil health assessment or an overall, don't stop using the word assessment, Ann. Yeah, now I can't think of a different word. A look at a farm field, both in depth, maybe not quite as much to the whole pedological type of look, but looking at whether it's functioning in an agronomic sense and giving some suggestions to growers. So some of the, and we've also had research that looked at soil health measurements. We've looked at the Cornell suite of tests, the original ones, and then some of the more recent ones. We've looked at the Haney test coming out of the States that Ray Archuleta is pretty keen on. Worked with Laura Vineyard again on looking at soil health testing methods and some of the ones that we've come back with, because you're right, somebody can look at one soil profile and go, this looks like a tough soil, and it's really soil type and management dependent and internal drainage. There's so many other things, but some of the things that we've come down to is looking at soil aggregate stability. We kind of like potentially mineralizable nitrogen. We think we like active carbon. There's some controversy around that. And respiration, as far as coming up with numbers. We're also looking within the soil health assessment piece that we're working on. We're also using VES, so that visual evaluation of soil structure, and some of the compaction analysis that you can get out of Taranamo, out of Germany. That's where we're at right now, looking at soil health measurements.
And the Ontario just recently enacted a Soils Act or Soil Protection Act, so something act. Was it defined in that act what soil health is?
We recently had a soil strategy put out. Is that
Maybe
what you're
that's what
referring
I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a soil strategy. So within that, yes, soil health dealt with, there's kind of 4 pillars looking at soil management, monitoring, and these should roll off my tongue. But yeah, soil health is dealt with in there a little bit, but it's still talking about function, because it varies depending on what soil type it is. I can't expect a Brookston clay that's a heavy dense clay with poor internal drainage to function and appear the same as a lovely Fox sandy loam.
So are there different degrees of soil health? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think there's different levels of soil health, but I think, okay, so here's where it might get a little controversial because people talk about soil health and soil quality. And the way I look at it, and not everybody agrees with me, in fact, lots don't. To me, soil quality is that inherent, the inherent features of that soil. So again, looking at that Brookston clay versus the sandy loam, very different soils, very different in their function, their protective capacity, and the things we need to do to manage them well. And then there's soil health, which is how well they're actually functioning. When I talk to groups home here, I usually have to admit, I use my husband as an example. He's of Dutch extract, so he likes his sweets and things like that. He's got a family history of a lot of heart problems and diabetes, things like that. So that's kind of his health quality, or his quality. And he's a truck driver too. So adding that on to it, you can guess what he might look like and where his health might be at. So that's his inherent quality. And then we manage his health through management, right? So he's got drugs and we try and manage diet as much as you can with a long distance trucker. And that's kind of the difference I use. I usually try and make sure I don't do that when my husband's in the audience. If that makes any sense.
Maybe I'll just pop in and throw in my 2 cents, Larry. Soil health is always better in the soil on the other side of the fence, maybe. But it is an abstract sort of term. There is no absolute value of soil health, the same as soil tilth or even soil quality. It's not like pure H2O is water and anything else is a change in content. So, but it's a popular term. And I guess I'm cynical, but I mean, I don't think they're going to find a test that is universally applied that can say this soil health of my soil is better than Ann's soil over there or Brad's over there. And it'll be a suite of things. I think there's a Soil Health Institute out of South Carolina or North Carolina that's doing the data dredging sort of experiment across the continent, measuring a whole suite of tests on soils everywhere to come up with sort of a soil health thing. And I mean, this has been going on for decades. That's what precipitated the Cornell suite of tests way back, was scientists trying to get their head around soil health. Unfortunately, scientists don't always have to pay for the tests. So in terms of a farm application, what can farmers do to determine their soil health? You probably can't afford the Cornell suite of tests or even some of these other exotic tests. The other issue with some of the tests are potential, like Ann said, sort of the inherent soil quality, and the others are a point in time, even a lab test for N mineralization. We heard at the beginning of this seminar series, Ross McKenzie talking about, the how many millions of tons of soil in a field, and you take one sample out of a little box to take to the lab, and the lab takes a thimbleful out to do the analysis on. So what are you representing? I usually, refer to farmers to look at some simple things. It's how does it feel? How did the soil crumble in terms of the aggregate stabilities? How does a shovel go into the ground? How does a driver go into the ground? That type of thing. What do you observe? Like that. I've had farmers in Alberta come up and say, wow, the year after peas, it was like so dramatically different, that field over there on the big slope. And then you question them as to why and what makes sense. I think Ann had some good things in terms of some kind of mineralization or potential mineralization test. Respiration is a quick and easy test. Now you can get these little straws that will measure it in situ in the field. So again, it's better to measure it in the field if you can, but again, the same position, the same circumstances. So don't go in a wet field and then go in the same spot in the field a week later when it's warmer and drier, and then what do those numbers mean? Soil health hasn't changed. It's just the ambient conditions have changed under which you're measuring soil health. So it's a slippery slope to, I think, to get into the measurements of soil health and to use it as some sort of metric to judge whether farmers are improving soil health, this farmer over that farmer. It's good to have some measures like that, some quick and easy measures, so that you can chart your own course and say, yes, I've noticed my infiltration is better after cover crops or after this. I've noticed, the tilth is different, or it feels better, or I have less disease, or whatever the case is. Comes back to farmers keeping good records, field records.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it for you and I, Tom, is, and probably Ann, we can walk onto a farmer's field and look at vegetation and kick the soil around, throw, jab a spade in the ground and go, yeah, this field, these soils are in pretty good shape. But there's a lot of tacit knowledge and a lot of experience that goes into that assessment. Mm-hmm. And what I'm seeing is that, again, people are coming up to me and saying, well, our goal is to have a healthy soil. And you're going, well, I mean, if the guy's farming a gray luvasol, yeah, it's a pretty healthy gray luvasol. Do you want to compare that to the health of a thick orthic black chernozem on, silt loam material? No, because, that's almost an impossible comparison to make. Yet both soils are functioning well. They're really, really different from each other. But one guy's, you can't tell one guy you inherently have a healthier soil than Joe down the road who's farming something completely different. And that's part of the issue that the mental problems I'm having with this, this whole terminology of soil health. Like, well, people banter, throw the term around, but it's like, well, it's so abstract. How is a soil scientist when I go and try and define that for someone? Is it pH? Is it infiltration? What is it? So, mm-hmm. Anyways,
it's abstract, and yet it's also driven a lot of interest and a lot of conversations.
Yes,
which I think that's important, because it's got people talking about some of the best management practices, or whatever you want to call them, talking about crop rotation, talking about cover cropping, talking about adding organic amendments, reducing tillage. And it's at least brought a new shine to that discussion a little bit.
Absolutely.
And they shouldn't be comparing one soil type or field to field. Yeah, looking across the fence row, you always think that guy's doing it wrong. And to be fair, there's a number of guys here who, when they start to play around looking at soil health measurements, there's a number of them that have been playing around using the underwear. Yeah, they'll slip across the fence row and they'll bury a pair in the next door neighbor's field just to hold them up and compare them. But I usually encourage them to take a look at a fence row, an undisturbed area that's close and adjacent to the field, that's the same soil type, roughly. And at least that gives them a structural comparison, so they can see where's their soil at compared to an relatively undisturbed piece, and what is the difference in how water flows through it? What is the difference in that structural stability? Fertility may be way off, but.
And I agree. I think the term soil health has sort of precipitated a bunch of conversations and farmers paying attention to soil and soil properties and dynamics and things. So that's great. And I think now the onus is on all of us to help them along that path of what sort of sensible measurements or monitoring or things like that can you do starting from now. It's your soil quality or soil health is whatever it is now. How are you going to observe changes in that soil health based on the management you do? And it may be some simple sort of tests, like I say, just stick a screwdriver in the ground, the feel of the soil, that sort of thing. Could be visual assessment, and you mentioned the visual field assessment. Food and Agriculture Organization a number of years ago came out with a whole list of books for area regions around the world on visual soil health assessment. So again, not venturing into the analytics side, but just what does it look like? Yeah, over large scale, small scale, things like that. You can get, as you know, as much variation within a field as you can within a township.
Yeah, the challenge though is that, and we've done some focus groups with a few growers on this, which is why we're heading towards this soil health assessment plan. So the SHAP package, they want analytical numbers. They want numbers that they can compare, which is part of the reason why we're looking at VES and why we're looking at Teramo and a few select. And I like that you raised the problem of cost for a lot of these tests. If you start looking at the Cornell suite, a lot of it's paid for by their local government. If I have to pay for it by myself in Ontario, it's going to be more than $200 a sample. We're still struggling to get every grower to do a fertility sample on a regular basis. So $200 a sample is a non-starter.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of these other things you can do relatively inexpensively. And some of the visual things, visual assessments that you can do that can at least give you a number. Because yeah, the shovel with experience, the screwdriver with experience, the challenge is looking at it today and looking at it 5 years, 10 years down the road. How do you compare that to know that you've changed from whatever your baseline was? So, and that's the pushback that I've got from farmers is they want numbers, actual numbers that they can compare.
But with the change in baseline, now versus 5 years from now, there's obviously the largest change would be the economic return of whatever crop that they've got planted, right? I mean, if 5 years from now, if I institute or throw in some different management techniques to improve my soils, and 5 years down the road, hey, I'm getting higher yields with reduced inputs. Well, then it's working, right? So that's the simple one. But I think sometimes we get too wound up in the numbers, because we don't know as much as we know as soil scientists is how much we don't know, and the system is so complex that we don't know by tweaking one thing if it's going to help another thing or if it's going to screw something else down the road. You know what I mean?
Well, and truthfully, in most fields, you're not tweaking one thing at a time, because if you're shifting your system a bit, at least here, I'm pretty sure guys are going to start, they won't be growing the same hybrid this year that they're growing next year, and certainly not 5 years down the road or 15. And then there's everything else that goes on. But I think you're right. Where it will show up and where you can put some measure on it is how do you do on those rough years, the dry years, the too wet years, the stress years. And that's what some of the long-term crop rotation projects here have shown is those stress years, especially the dry, hot, these better managed soils, the ones with the better rotation, the less tillage, better overall organic matter, soil structure, all those things that we call soil health, they're the ones that have more consistent, dependable yields over time.
Cool, thanks.
And we do have another question from Ken Pearl. And his question was, adoption of minimal tillage has reduced wind and water erosion. The events of January 13th and the following Tuesday are disappointing. Any recommendations for future erosion control or reduction? And the events of January 13 is we had a large low pressure system move through the Lethbridge area, southern Alberta, and it was substantial. I've heard 120 pivots were actually taken out, massive damage. But any recommendations?
Put up a big wind fence. Yeah, it's those extreme events. I think with both wind and water erosion, I remember at the Coshocton watershed in Ohio, they look back 120 years or something since research started there, and over 90% or like 95% of all the erosion that occurred in the watershed occurred just from a few events. So it's these extreme events, and wind is one of them. So it's those extreme events. Do you think they're going to occur? Do you want to take a chance? How much soil are you going to lose if it catches versus is a ounce of prevention worth the pound of cure sort of thing? So is it good to have some kind of barrier there? And again, I was getting at, if you can't have a barrier on the field, can you have a barrier at the perimeter of the field? Can you have some kind of cover on the field, anchored in one way or another? Can you do it vegetatively if you know you've got a problem? I know in southwestern Alberta, some farmers there that have changed their field boundaries to change their cropping systems on different soil types. So if they have a sandy soil, they are going to be putting rye or some plant with a lot of biomass content in there and treat it a little differently than the other fields that are more stable. So yeah, it's conditions like that. I mean, my brother has a trucking company too. He happened to be on the road between Lethbridge and Calgary that day and traveling very slowly. They just needed to keep it on the road, and house that he has in Grantham, he lost shingles on that, and you just can't design shingles to have a long life expectancy in that sort of country unless it's metal. So I don't know if that answers the question, Ken. It's individual circumstances. Look at the field, look at what you can do on the field itself, vegetatively, mechanically, even like I say, grass strips, cover crop of one form or another. I mean, go to complete direct seeding. Don't worry about the minimum till where I need to till for whatever reason. And then is there some kind of barrier system that you can have around the perimeter of the field or the adjacent field? Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, well, I just say that all the advances that have been made and across the province here, from what I've seen again in the dryland areas on cereal grain production, there's some real pluses. But again, down here in southern Alberta on those row crops, we see some producers taking action after potatoes, for instance. They'll put down a cover crop, walk the pivot over it. And they're feeding probably a bushel, maybe even half a bushel of barley or oats, and that seems to be very effective. But now we're getting later with the sugar beet harvest every year for production reasons and for storage in piles, and the potato harvest seems to be getting later and later for whatever reasons, a number of reasons. And so it's pretty disappointing that all those good lessons, so the cover crops aren't going in like they have in some years past, or I guess there's just a certain amount of fatigue, perhaps. A lot of that's rented land, so I would suggest that if anyone's going to rent land out to row crop production, particularly potatoes, they should probably, if it was possible, write something into that contract that when all is said and done, that there's a cover crop put in, or else the landowner itself comes in. I'm not sure what all the specifics are there and would do that. But, those events are really disappointing from that perspective. With all the gains, that's been negated 10 years, like you say, that severe event, 10 years of good erosion controls probably been walked back by that 2-day event. And the Tuesday was just as devastating as far as wind erosion. Total brownout on Highway 3 near Barnwell, from my experience and stuff. But yeah, those are issues. And I guess my concern too, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but concern is with the demise here of Alberta agriculture research scientists. I don't know who's doing the research, so maybe that's one thing. Again, and the companies, as good as they are in addressing productivity and agronomics, I don't know where the interest is, because there's nothing in a bag or a bulk bag or a liquid form that you can put down to improve soil or to prevent erosion and salinity, for that matter. So there's less interest in the public domain. And I don't know how I get around this. There's been some, again, disappointing in the back, with all the that yourself and Alberta Agriculture has done in the past. We just kind of see a deterioration for this ongoing generation and that ability, to keep up the good work and to apply those things. And then I guess just in answer, in respect to Larry and the like too, putting numbers to it is very difficult, but I think if you walk around the field for any length of time, and you see those eroded knolls where the A horizon's gone and most of the B and the lime's right at the surface, and you look at the crop there, particularly in row crop, there's zero production off of that, of any factor, and so I think I applaud that, that this quantifying soil quality and soil health in absolute numbers is very difficult, but I encourage all these agronomists to go out there and put a shovel in. I think those recommendations that you made and mentioned, particularly soil structure, physical properties of soils, infiltration rate, are huge factors. And I like that idea. I think in my 35, 40 years of experience, I think that fence line comparison is excellent. When you see when you see that fence line that's trapped, that topsoil that's gone off, and like 30 centimeter, 40 centimeter difference in elevation between that fence row and that deflated area where the erosion has occurred. That's a very telling story, and may not be scientifically defensible, but I think gives you a good practical comparison of what could have been. As a benchmark, because that's our problem at this point, right? Benchmarking what quality soil is.
Yeah, I would say too, givens for the future is the cost of agriculture land, or the value of it, is going to go up, and the incidence of extreme weather events will be happening more frequently. So as a landowner, what's it worth to you to protect the value of your land? The inherent capital value and the productive value. And I think, Ken, you brought up a good point that if you're a landowner renting your land out to someone growing row crops, maybe look at your contract requirements or stipulations in there. I've talked to a number of farmers years ago, even renting land for just cereal crops, and they had to comply with certain requirements that the landowner required of them that were good for soil health. And after a couple of years of that, they figured out how to do it, and they could see the value of it, and they applied it to the rest of the farm. So an erosive, catastrophic erosive event like we've had will eliminate, decades and decades of soil building and soil health. Also, like I mentioned in my talk, it increases the variability in the field, which brings up weed problems, salinity problems, all these other things. So it doesn't make farming any more fun for forever, for a long time. So it's worth it to have extraordinary event and extraordinary management to protect that.
Right. So I think going back to that too, I think Larry made the point too that he seems that, farmers that he's dealing with, their yields are good, profitability is good. But, we're in a time here where commodity prices are very strong compared to, again, what we've seen over the last several decades. And then the introduction of, no doubt, superior varieties, and better fertilizer management, again, based on scientific research and applied research. but that's all I'm asking, and again, just for everyone, I'd like to emphasize the point is that your starting point is your soil. And again, if you're going to put in those high, the cost of inputs today in modern is just astronomical compared to what it has been. So you better make darn sure that you're getting the yield that you expect out of those crops and all that investment. So I guess that's my final statement. Other than thanks for you and Ann and the presentations here today. Very informative.
Welcome.
And there was a note from Robert Dunn in the chat as well. And he mentions there's a great presentation on soil health by Henry Jansen. You could find it with a Google search. And the Chinook Applied Research Association, located in Oyen, is offering a soil health assessment combination of the Cornell Soil Health Assessment along with the Soil Food Web, Ingram, to ID some of the species that are indicators of the soil microbial community. Would anyone have any follow-up questions for Ann or Tom? You can either unmute your mic located in the bottom left-hand corner, or you can type your questions into the chat.
Brad, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Rob.
Okay, well, mainly just to say thanks to Ann and Tom for great presentations. I actually kind of was tied up and didn't get on, was a little late getting on to the presentations there, but really enjoyed that and the discussion. And, it's for an old soil conservation guy in Southern Alberta, it was, I share Ken's heartache when you see the soil erosion from those extreme events that we had here this last couple of weeks. And of course, a couple of the farmers one of the farmers I'm working with, that he's looking at getting out there with some manure to stabilize some of those focal points. So I just kind of, as a bit of a comment. And Tom, just you may have mentioned it in your talk there, the challenge that we run into in Southern Alberta with our Chinooks. We get the freeze thaw. We've had 2 or 3 or 4 freeze thaws now through the fall, and that soil just is so vulnerable right now. And so situations that looked like they were going to be safe and pretty secure irrigation going into the winter, but now everything's kind of been leveled off because of freeze thaw. The aggregates are kind of broken down. And so just to comment, I know that's one of the real difficult situations that farmers face right now is what's going to happen in what is traditionally our worst period for erosion between mid-January to the 1st of March.
Yep. Well, good point, Rob. It's the freeze thaw that's the other enemy that we have, and what looks like it's fine in the fall can change dramatically over the winter. I've seen in southwestern Alberta, guys having to go out and bale shredding and hairpinning straw in at this time of year to protect it, because they were starting to see problems already. I remember years ago I was talking to a fellow that grew up in an irrigation farm in southern Alberta, and he said his father wouldn't let the kids out onto the field to play after harvest, or especially in the spring, because just their footprints of the kids, playing catch or tag out in the fields was enough to start an erosion event. So he said we weren't allowed to play in the fields; they had to stay in the yard.
Yeah, it's so vulnerable, right now, and everything's just kind of fluffy out there. We're sort of hoping we can get a heavy, wet snow here in the next, week or 10 days, and that would people would be able to sleep a little easier during some of those windstorms that inevitably will happen in February. But yeah, manure, as you say, some people I'm sure have been out ridging already, trying to rough the surface a little bit. But it's a tough scenario for the farmers right now.
And I mean, the fact that we have it here now, and the fact that we can remember even recent events and several times, means that it's going to be happening again. So where's your due diligence and taking precautions, because maybe something you could have done in the fall would save all of this emergency management now. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Rob, for your question. Does anyone else have any follow-up questions? We're getting a bit late in the day, but if you have any questions, please present them now. Looks like there's crickets in the audience. Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you, Tom, for your excellent presentations and for participating in this question and answer period. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who attended the session today. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can just submit them to my email, bcalder@warnercounty.ca. Thank you again, everyone. And I'll end the session now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.